It is November 1948. In the freezing rubble of divided Berlin, 7-year-old Mercedes Wield writes a highly improbable letter, addressed simply to the chocolate uncle at Tempelhof Airport. She asks him to drop candy near her house, which she claims he can spot from the air by the white chickens in her yard. The envelope enters a chaotic military postal system currently processing thousands of operational documents for the largest aerial supply chain in history. By all standard military logic, this fragile request should have been immediately discarded as entirely irrelevant to the grueling life-or-death operation taking place overhead, but it was not. Instead, that fragile envelope became a focal point in a chain of events that altered the psychological landscape of the early Cold War. This is the story of how an unauthorized, entirely rogue gesture by a single American transport pilot intersected with the desperate reality of a starving German child. We will trace how a few sticks of chewing gum, initially handed through a barbed wire fence, morphed into Operation Little Vittles, evolving from a localized, improvised initiative into a massive, unexpected geopolitical asset. To understand the sheer improbability of this, you have to look at the brutal reality of the skies over Germany. This was a deeply strained military logistics network, fundamentally engineered to deliver heavy coal, flour, and industrial supplies under extreme operational duress. Crews were flying exhausted in treacherous weather, navigating a perilous air corridor where the margin for error was effectively zero. Yet, embedded within this grueling mechanical grind, the military apparatus was suddenly weaponizing tiny, hand-tied parachutes of candy. How did a seemingly trivial humanitarian gesture cut through the tension of a ruined metropolis and ultimately help break the Soviet siege of Berlin? To grasp the sheer audacity of this, you must first understand the absolute strangulation of the city. In the early summer of 1948, the uneasy alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany finally fractured. The Soviet Union, controlling the eastern zone of occupied Germany, viewed the Allied presence in the western sectors of Berlin as a strategic vulnerability. Berlin sat deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, connected to the west only by a fragile network of designated highways, railways, and canals. On June 24th, under the pretense of vague technical difficulties, Soviet authorities severed them all. Passenger trains were halted at the border. Freight cars carrying essential food supplies were turned back. Barges moving up the Elbe River were blocked, and the Autobahn was completely barricaded. It was a calculated, bloodless siege. Joseph Stalin's objective was not military annihilation, but political capitulation. By cutting off physical arteries to the city, the Soviet command intended to starve the Western powers into abandoning their sectors, effectively absorbing the entirety of Berlin into the Soviet sphere. The suddenness of the blockade triggered an immediate survival crisis for the 2 million civilians in the western sectors. This was a metropolis still bearing the catastrophic scars of the Second World War. Millions lived in bombed-out ruins, surrounded by mountains of brick and twisted steel. The city produced almost nothing of its own. Every calorie of food and every lump of coal had to be imported. When the Soviet barricades fell, Allied quartermasters ran the terrifying mathematics of the city's stockpiles. The numbers were grim. Western Berlin had exactly 36 days of food remaining and a mere 45-day supply of coal. In a city where winter temperatures regularly plunged below freezing, coal was not just a commodity for generating electricity, it was the sole means of keeping the population from freezing to death in their unheated, shattered homes. In Washington and London, military planners faced an agonizing choice. Either abandon Berlin and hand a massive geopolitical victory to the Soviets, or attempt an armed convoy down the Autobahn, which risked sparking World War III. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, adamantly refused to retreat. He recognized that surrendering Berlin would collapse European confidence in the West. Instead, the Allied command opted for a third, seemingly impossible alternative, supplying a major industrial metropolis entirely from the air. Military logistics experts initially declared the concept mathematically absurd. No one had ever attempted to sustain 2 million people solely by aircraft. To keep the civilian population alive and basic utilities functioning, Western Berlin required a bare minimum of 4,500 tons of supplies every single day. Supplying the city would require a logistical miracle, transforming the sky into a massive, synchronized conveyor belt. The resulting operation rapidly evolved into a brutal industrial-scale grind. that pushed both men and machines to their absolute limits. The Allied Air Forces commandeered every available heavy transport plane, eventually standardizing on the four-engine C-54 Skymaster, capable of hauling 10 tons of cargo. These massive aircraft were funneled into 3 narrow air corridors, each just 20 miles wide, connecting West Germany to the beleaguered city. The choreography of the Berlin Airlift was merciless. Air traffic controllers implemented a rigid, unforgiving system. Aircraft flew stacked at specific altitudes, maintaining strict airspeeds and intervals. If a pilot missed their approach at Tempelhof Airport, often obscured by dense fog, driving rain, or blinding snow, they were not allowed a second attempt. They had to fly their cargo all the way back to their origin base to avoid disrupting the relentless inbound flow. At its peak, a heavily loaded transport was touching down on the steel-planked runways every 3 minutes, day and night, regardless of the weather. The physical toll on the crews was staggering. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, navigating by primitive radio beacons and radar through zero-visibility conditions. Mechanics worked outside in freezing rain, patching tires and swapping blown engines, their hands cracked from the cold and harsh aviation fluids. And the cargo itself was actively hostile to the aircraft. The vast majority of the tonnage was coal, loaded in standard canvas sacks that leaked fine, abrasive black dust. This dust choked the pilots, obscured the instruments, and ground down the control cables, creating a constant, lethal maintenance nightmare. This was a sterile, unforgiving equation of survival. Every ounce of payload capacity was meticulously calculated. The cargo manifest prioritized dehydrated potatoes, flour, powdered milk, dried eggs, medical supplies, and above all, coal. There was absolutely no room for luxury, no margin for sentimentality, and zero tolerance for deviation. The military apparatus was fighting a desperate war against time, weather, and starvation. To the planners at Airlift headquarters, the operation was a flawless, impersonal machine designed strictly to deliver caloric and thermal units to a besieged grid. The rules were absolute, the priorities were rigidly fixed, and the human element was entirely subordinated to the tonnage. That was the established reality of the airlift, right up until the moment one exhausted pilot decided to break the rules. First Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen was one of the hundreds of exhausted airmen trapped in that relentless cycle. By July 1948, the young pilot was flying multiple round trips a day, hauling tons of abrasive coal into Tempelhof. During a brief layover, while his C-54 Skymaster was being frantically unloaded, Halvorsen walked to the barbed wire perimeter fence. Standing on the other side were about 30 German children. In post-war Europe, Allied soldiers were accustomed to a grim routine, starving children aggressively begging for rations. But the children at Tempelhof did not ask for a single piece of food. Standing in the heavy dust of the landing aircraft, they merely asked the pilot not to give up on them. The quiet dignity of a starving population deeply unsettled the American pilot. Reaching into his pocket, Halvorsen found exactly 2 sticks of Wrigley's Double Mint gum. He passed them through the barbed wire. The children did not fight over it. They carefully divided the 2 sticks into tiny fragments, and those who did not get a piece simply passed around the foil wrappers just to smell the mint. Struck by this disciplined restraint, Halvorsen made a spontaneous, highly unauthorized promise. He told the children he would drop enough chocolate for all of them from his plane the following day. When they asked how they would identify his specific aircraft among the endless stream of identical gray transports, he told them he would wiggle his wings on the final approach. It was a remarkably reckless commitment. The military airspace over Berlin was fiercely regulated. Altering the flight path of a heavy cargo plane or dropping undeclared objects violated strict operational directive. Doing so over a densely populated area surrounded by hostile Soviet forces was an immediate court-martial offense. Ignoring the risk, Halvorsen returned to his base in West Germany, pooled his candy rations, and constructed miniature parachutes out of standard-issue handkerchiefs and string. The next day, as his heavily loaded Skymaster descended over the ruins of Berlin, he spotted the children gathered by the fence. Taking the heavy yoke, he rocked the massive wings of the C-54 back and forth. As they crossed the airfield perimeter, Halvorsen signaled his flight engineer to shove the improvised parachutes out of the aircraft's emergency flare chute. For several weeks, Halvorsen and his crew managed to keep their illicit drops a secret, but a besieged city has no secrets. A German journalist photographed the tiny white parachutes falling from the sky, and the story rapidly hit the Berlin press. When the reports inevitably reached base command, Halvorsen was abruptly summoned by his commanding officer. Walking into headquarters, the lieutenant knew exactly what awaited him. He braced himself to be permanently grounded and formally court-martialed for jeopardizing the strict discipline of the airlift. When Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen walked into his commanding officer's office, he fully anticipated the abrupt end of his military flying career. The entire airlift operation was hanging by a thread, running on exhausted crews, stressed airframes, and a meticulously calculated fuel budget. There was absolutely no margin for a rogue pilot throwing unauthorized debris out of government aircraft over a highly volatile military zone. His immediate superior was furious, slamming a German newspaper onto the desk. On the front page was a photograph of Halvorsen's C-54 Skymaster, easily identifiable by its tail number, with tiny white parachutes trailing behind it in the Berlin sky. The infraction was severe and undeniable: violation of strict airspace protocols, unauthorized release of cargo, and deliberately jeopardizing the aerodynamic safety of a heavy transport plane. A court-martial seemed inevitable. But the chain of command for the Berlin Airlift terminated with Major General William H. Tunner, and Tunner was not a conventional military thinker. Tunner was the ruthless, brilliant architect of the operation, a commander who had previously engineered the massive aerial supply route over the Himalayas during World War II. He was an icy, calculating leader obsessed with tonnage, turnaround times, and the sterile mathematics of logistics. He demanded that pilots fly perfectly synchronized routes and had explicitly forbidden any deviation from the operational tempo. Yet, when the intelligence reports of Halvorsen's illicit candy drops finally reached Tunner's desk, the general did not see a breach of discipline. He saw a highly effective, unexpected weapon in a war of psychological attrition. Tunner understood a fundamental truth about the Soviet blockade that many military hardliners missed. The siege of Berlin was not merely a physical barricade, it was an ideological stress test. Joseph Stalin was betting that cold, starving civilians would eventually turn against the occupying Western forces and demand capitulation to Soviet authority simply to survive the coming winter. The Allied troops in Berlin had been the enemy just 3 years prior. They had bombed the city into a pulverized wasteland. The trust between the occupied and the occupiers was dangerously fragile, shadowed by the recent trauma of the war. Tunner realized that Halvorsen, using nothing more than a handful of chewing gum and handkerchiefs, had instantly bridged that psychological chasm. The candy drops were generating a massive wave of public goodwill, transforming the American aircraft in the eyes of the Berliners from instruments of past destruction into unquestionable symbols of salvation. Rather than grounding the young lieutenant, General Tunner officially absorbed the rogue action into the military apparatus. He sanctioned the drops, ordered Halvorsen to keep doing it, and formally christened the effort Operation Little Vittles. What began as one pilot pooling his own meager candy rations rapidly mutated into an unprecedented logistical pipeline. Halvorsen's immediate squadron quickly emptied their own pockets, donating their chocolate bars and gum. When that supply was exhausted, the operation scaled up to encompass the entire airbase. But to maintain the momentum of Operation Little Vittles, the military needed resources that were not in the standard quartermaster's inventory: raw sugar, chocolate, cloth, and string. As news of the candy bomber reached the United States through wire reports and newsreels, the American public responded with an overwhelming, uncoordinated surge of donations. The military supply chain suddenly found itself navigating an entirely new type of cargo. The sheer mechanics of processing this civilian goodwill required its own dedicated logistical shadow network. In the United States, school children in Massachusetts and housewives in Ohio began repurposing old bed sheets, cutting them into squares, tying them with butcher's twine, and attaching whatever candy they could purchase. The National Confectioners Association recognized the immense public relations value and began shipping tons of raw candy directly to the military. Soon, massive crates filled with thousands of pre-tied miniature parachutes were arriving at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, where they were loaded onto transatlantic military transports, flown to the United Kingdom, and then ferried to the airlift bases in West Germany. Integrating this non-essential cargo into the life-or-death rhythm of the Berlin Airlift created a bizarre operational paradox. The C-54 Skymasters were stripped down to maximize their payload of abrasive, heavy coal, yet crews were now deliberately finding space for cardboard boxes filled with delicate candy parachutes. The physical act of dropping the candy also required a dangerous improvisation. The main cargo doors of the C-54 could not be safely opened in flight without disrupting the aerodynamics of the heavily loaded plane. Instead, crews had to use the aircraft's emergency flare chute, a narrow metal tube located behind the rear door, originally designed for dropping magnesium flares. As the transport descended toward Tempelhof, navigating the perilous approach over the bombed-out apartment blocks at the Neukölln district, the flight engineer would position himself by the flare chute. When Halvorsen gave the signal by rocking the massive wings, the engineer would frantically shove handfuls of the tiny parachutes down the metal tube. It was a hazardous maneuver. If the parachutes deployed too early, the string and cloth could blow back and tangle in the aircraft's crucial elevator controls or tail assembly, potentially causing a catastrophic crash on final approach. Yet, despite the mechanical risks, the sky over Tempelhof soon blossomed with hundreds of tiny white canopies every single day. Across the ruined city, in the Soviet military headquarters at Karlshorst, intelligence officers watched the sky with growing unease. Initially, the Soviet command dismissed the candy drops as a pathetic, short-lived public relations stunt. In their internal intelligence briefings, it was categorized as a cheap capitalist trick, a hollow gesture that could not possibly replace the thousands of tons of heavy coal and grain required to keep the city from freezing. The Soviet military apparatus, strictly focused on the rigid metrics of power and physical control, assumed that a few ounces of chocolate would be meaningless against the crushing, systemic weight of the blockade. They believed that as winter set in and temperatures dropped, the superficial charm of the American candy would evaporate, and the desperate population would inevitably riot against the Western Allies, begging for Soviet intervention. But as the late summer turned to autumn, and the drops escalated from hundreds of parachutes to thousands, the Soviet leadership began to recognize a deeply alarming shift in the city's psychological landscape. The ideological loyalty of the ruined capital was visibly pivoting. The Soviet administration had positioned itself as the rational, inevitable savior of Germany, waiting patiently for the West to exhaust itself and fail. Instead, they were watching a generation of German children, the future of the divided nation, forming deep emotional bonds with the very American pilots who had leveled their city. The candy was not providing caloric survival, it was providing ideological immunity. Every miniature parachute that drifted down into the ruins was highly visible, undeniable physical proof that the West had not abandoned the city. It was a daily, theatrical demonstration of American logistical superiority and excess, broadcast directly into the sky above Soviet-controlled territory. The realization that they were losing the psychological war triggered intense anxiety within the Soviet command. The physical barricades on the Autobahn and the railways were holding perfectly, blocking all ground transport, but the mental blockade was failing catastrophically. The Soviets suddenly found themselves entirely helpless against the propaganda defeat raining down from the clouds. In response, they pivoted from dismissal to aggressive countermeasures. They filed formal, angry protests with the Allied Control Council, arguing that the drops violated established airspace agreements. They officially claimed the low-flying transports were a deliberate hazard to civilian safety, and that the candy drops were creating dangerous riots in the streets. Seek to disrupt the operations physically, they deployed powerful anti-aircraft searchlights around the edges of the air corridors, actively attempting to blind the American and British pilots during their highly sensitive night approaches. Furthermore, the Soviet administration attempted to jam the radio frequencies of RIAS, the radio in the American sector, which was broadcasting updates on the airlift and reading letters of gratitude from German children on the air. When diplomatic intimidation and electronic interference failed, the Soviet command attempted to counter the drops with their own localized propaganda. The Soviet-controlled press launched blistering attacks on the operation, warning parents that the American candy was poisoned, or at the very least, a cynical manipulation to distract from the impending starvation. Recognizing that they needed to offer a physical alternative to the American drops, the Soviet authorities announced that any West Berliner who registered their ration card in the Soviet sector would immediately receive fresh milk, extra coal, and increased daily food rations. It was a highly calculated bribe, offering absolute immediate relief from the brutal deprivations of the airlift. Yet, in a staggering display of defiance, the vast majority of West Berliners completely rejected the offer. Despite the severe cold and the constant gnawing hunger, fewer than 5% of the Western population crossed the sector line to claim the Soviet rations. They chose to endure the grueling shortages of the airlift over the political submission demanded by the blockade. For the Soviet command, It was a humiliating realization. They could not break the civilian will, and a significant portion of that resilience was being fueled by handkerchief parachutes and chewing gum. However, the romanticized narrative of the candy bomber, as celebrated in Western newspapers and newsreels, sharply contrasted with the brutal, chaotic reality on the ground. From the cockpit of an approaching C-54, the drops looked like a pristine, orderly act of charity, with white canopies floating gently toward waiting hands. But down in the ruins of Berlin, it was an entirely different, far more violent environment. The American pilots had virtually no control over where the parachutes actually landed once they left the flare chute. The heavy transport planes were traveling at over 120 miles per hour, often descending through low cloud cover and crosswinds that whipped fiercely through the hollowed-out skeletons of the bombed architecture. The aerodynamics of a handkerchief tied with string were incredibly erratic. A payload shoved out of the aircraft would immediately scatter across miles of urban wasteland. The tiny parachutes caught updrafts from the warm ruins, snagged on the jagged steel reinforcements of destroyed apartment blocks, and drifted wildly off course. More dangerously, the wind frequently carried the candy across the sector boundaries into Soviet-controlled East Berlin. Children who attempted to chase the parachutes across these invisible, increasingly militarized borders risked being detained by East German police or Soviet border guards who had been strictly ordered to confiscate the illicit drops. Furthermore, the environment beneath the glide path was not a peaceful gathering of grateful citizens. It was a fiercely competitive scramble among desperate children living in a traumatized, resource-starved society. The drop zones directly beneath the Tempelhof approach path, particularly around the St. Thomas Cemetery, became highly contested territory. Teenagers and older boys, hardened by the trauma of the war and the ruthless economy of the black market, rapidly learned to track the flight patterns, calculate the wind drift, and physically dominate the primary landing areas. They formed aggressive packs, rushing the drop zones the moment an aircraft wiggled its wings. When a parachute touched down, it sparked a frantic, physical scramble in the sharp brick rubble and shattered glass. In this brutal, street-level competition, smaller children were routinely pushed aside, trampled, or intimidated out of the drop zones. The massive, coordinated scale of Operation Little Vittles, a geopolitical triumph involving transatlantic shipping, industrial-scale candy production, and military aviation, ultimately clashed with the uncontrollable, localized chaos of a destroyed metropolis. The military could conquer the sky with radar and rigid schedules, but they could not dictate the laws of gravity, wind, or the desperate human behavior in the ruins below. This systemic flaw created a heartbreaking reality for thousands of children who were entirely cut off from the drops. If a child lived in a district obscured by taller ruins, or situated just a few miles away from the primary approach corridors, the entire operation was nothing more than an atmospheric rumor. They could hear the endless, deafening drone of the Pratt & Whitney engines vibrating through their ceilings day and night. They could see the silver silhouettes of the Skymasters cutting through the overcast sky. But the physical manifestation of the airlift, the parachutes, the chocolate, the tangible proof of survival never reached them. They were trapped in the logistical blind spots of a massive aerial conveyor belt. The pilots, focused strictly on maintaining their precise glide slopes and surviving the treacherous approach, had no way of knowing who was standing in the shadows of the secondary ruins, watching the sky in vain. The massive military apparatus had successfully weaponized hope, but it was distributing it blindly into the wind, and it was in one of these obscured, heavily contested zones, far from the chaotic scrambles of the Tempelhof perimeter, that 7-year-old Mercedes Wild found herself constantly looking up at the passing aircraft. She was surrounded by the sharp ruins of her neighborhood, waiting for a parachute that the wind, the older boys, and the chaotic physics of the drops ensured would never arrive. The white chickens wandering in Mercedes's yard, the precise navigational landmarks she had so carefully described in her letter to the chocolate uncle, were utterly invisible from a massive transport plane tearing through the gray overcast. The heartwarming Hollywood myth of a perfectly targeted parachute landing directly at a child's feet simply shattered against the chaotic physics of the operation. Despite her daily vigil in the rubble, Mercedes never caught a single piece of candy. Her experience was not the exception, it was the harsh, statistical rule. The enduring romanticized image of the candy bomber severely obscures the grim, mechanical lethality of the actual airlift taking place around it. Those tiny white parachutes were purely a symbolic gesture. Berlin's actual survival did not hinge on chocolate or chewing gum. It depended entirely on the grueling, unglamorous delivery of thousands of tons of abrasive coal, fragile glass vials of medicine, and heavy sacks of dehydrated potatoes. This was not a humanitarian fairy tale. It was a deeply dangerous military operation executed in highly hostile airspace. As autumn gave way to the blinding, freezing fog of late 1948, the narrow air corridors rapidly became a graveyard. Heavy Skymasters and Dakotas, blinded by zero-visibility weather and weighed down by ice accumulating on their wings, slammed into ridgelines, collided in the dense clouds, or crashed short of the Tempelhof runway. The relentless, unforgiving tempo of this aerial conveyor belt ultimately claimed the lives of over 100 Allied airmen. The candy pushed out of the emergency flare chutes was just a fleeting distraction from a systemic, industrial-scale gamble with human life. And that desperate gamble was about to face its most severe test. The strict physical limitations of this improvised supply chain, along with the fragile endurance of the 2 million civilians trapped below, were colliding with the onset of a brutal, unyielding winter. The plunging temperatures pushed the airlift machinery and the freezing, starving population it served to the absolute breaking point. As December 1948 arrived, the Soviet blockade found its most devastating ally, the brutal German winter. Temperatures plummeted, freezing the canals and sealing off the last porous routes for black market smuggling. Inside the western sectors, the survival equation grew impossibly thin. The daily coal ration was reduced to a few pounds per household, barely enough to heat a single room for a few hours. Families huddled in their heavy winter coats indoors, listening to the relentless, synchronized drone of the Pratt & Whitney engines overhead. The fundamental question of the siege was no longer just mathematical. It was a grueling physical and psychological test. Could a mechanical supply chain, operating at the absolute limits of aviation technology, outlast the freezing, demoralizing grip of the Soviet blockade? Down in the rubble, 7-year-old Mercedes had long given up on her white chickens. The sky above Tempelhof remained filled with transport planes, but the harsh reality of her geography meant she was permanently shut out of the drop zones. The promise of the chocolate uncle seemed to have been swallowed entirely by the chaotic, industrial scale of the airlift. Then, the delivery arrived. It did not come romantically drifting down from the clouds in a cinematic moment of triumph. It arrived through the grinding, battered machinery of the regular postal system. A German letter carrier, navigating the icy, bombed-out streets of West Berlin, handed an envelope to her family. It bore an official American military return address. Inside was a formal typed letter, drafted on military stationery by First Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen. In it, he personally apologized to the young girl. He explained that from his altitude, flying a heavily loaded Skymaster at over 100 miles an hour through the winter overcast, it was simply impossible to spot her white chickens in the vast expanse of the ruined city. But he had not just sent an apology. Neatly enclosed in the envelope alongside the typed page was a single piece of peppermint candy, carefully tied to a miniature parachute. It was a stunningly quiet conclusion to her desperate request. Yet, in the darkest, coldest months of the siege, that fragile piece of mail became a profound psychological anchor. It provided something far more powerful than caloric survival. The letter was undeniable, physical proof that the immense Allied logistical apparatus, a sterile, unforgiving machine wholly obsessed with fuel budgets, radar vectors, and daily tonnage, had not completely erased the individual. In a war defined by the ruthless mechanical crushing of populations, a military pilot navigating the most intense aerial supply chain in history had actually stopped, read a child's letter, and found a way to answer. That individual resilience, multiplied across 2 million isolated civilians, ultimately broke the Soviet strategy. As the brutal winter thawed into the spring of 1949, the intelligence reports reaching Moscow painted a bleak picture for the blockade. The massive Allied conveyor belt in the sky was not collapsing under the strain of the weather. Instead, it was becoming relentlessly efficient, consistently delivering more daily tonnage than the city had previously received by rail. Recognizing that the airlift could sustainably bypass their physical barricades indefinitely, the Soviet command finally relented. In May 1949, the checkpoints were lifted, and the land routes into Berlin were reopened. The blockade was over, but the psychological landscape of Europe had been permanently altered. The documented correspondence between the young German girl and the American pilot was not merely a footnote of the siege. It represented the true, enduring legacy of the operation. That long-standing connection, forged in the darkest months of 1948, remained intact for decades, culminating in a verified, real-life meeting between Mercedes and Halvorsen in 1972. General Tunner's massive fleet of transport planes had successfully held the physical territory of West Berlin with millions of tons of abrasive coal, dried potatoes, and flour. But brute force tonnage and mechanical logistics only kept the city's population breathing. It was the calculated, deeply human execution of Operation Little Vittles that permanently secured the geopolitical allegiance of a shattered Germany. In the vast, impersonal mathematics of industrial warfare, the candy drops demonstrated that the battle for hearts and minds was not a secondary objective. The operation proved definitively that in a war of ideological attrition, a fragile, symbolic gesture of hope could be as strategically vital as raw aviation fuel. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet command had engineered a ruthless siege, meticulously constructing a blockade of iron, silence, and starvation. They calculated that a freezing, isolated metropolis would inevitably collapse, forcing 2 million desperate civilians into absolute political submission. It was designed to be an unbreakable masterpiece of geopolitical strangulation. Yet when the spring of 1949 finally arrived, the Soviet leadership was forced to quietly dismantle their barricades in total defeat. They watched their grand strategic ambitions completely unravel, dismantled by the deafening, relentless roar of heavy cargo planes and the astonishing, highly strategic deployment of chewing gum.